serious. What was the dirtiest trick ever pulled in the history of war? Story 1. In the trenches of France during World War I, General Monash was given the unenviable task of punching through the German line to claim the French town of La Hemelle. The way that Monash went about doing this was both revolutionary and bloody sneaky. The German forces were well equipped and well fortified, reinforced with heavy artillery and machine guns, and the troops were very well trained. Faced with these odds, Monash began to quote-unquote condition the German forces. Every day at dawn, he would let loose a barrage of smoke bombs followed by mustard gas canisters. The Germans, following their training, would equip themselves with gas masks that protected them. Monash kept up this bombardment for 2 weeks, and soon the Germans became accustomed to the pattern of attack and would immediately don their gas masks and hunker down at the first sign of smoke. But on the dawn of the 4th of July, the smoke bombs were not followed by gas, but by the Australians. The German gas masks protected them from mustard gas and smoke, but they also vastly impeded their vision, hearing, and ability to communicate. With the noise of the battle and the obscuring smoke, they were deaf and blind on the battlefield, and to make things worse, this was not an unprotected infantry massed attack, but a creeping barrage supported by a division of tanks, heavy artillery, and aircraft. The tanks protected the vulnerable infantry, and the artillery and aircraft prevented the Germans from effectively deploying anti-tank measures. The battle was over in just 90 minutes and marked the rise of mixed arms warfare. Story 2. The British pulled a dirty trick during the African campaign in World War II. At every well and oasis they could find, they hung a sign that said "Danger, Poison" in English and German. It was only when the Germans complained that poisoning wells were a war crime that the British pointed out that, yes, poisoning wells was a crime, but merely hanging signs were not. The water was perfectly drinkable. Story 3. Not sure if this counts as a quote-unquote trick, but Napoleon prior to the Battle of Marengo. Not only did he cross the Alps with his entire army, a completely unexpected move, but once across, the Austrians thought Napoleon would move to Genoa in order to relieve the siege of that city. Thousands were dying of starvation, and French General Massena desperately called for Napoleon's aid. Napoleon, in a ruthless and surprising move, ignored the calls for help and instead moved to attack the main portion of the Austrian army, eventually winning the Battle of Marengo. Massena surrendered Genoa, and it would be years before he eventually forgave Napoleon for abandoning him, and it would be years before Napoleon forgave Massena for surrendering. Story 4. The Battle of Majnoon in the Iraqi-Iranian War. You wait until nighttime and you will see how we are killing these Iranian dogs, an Iraqi officer said with a broad grin. We are frying them like eggplants. He then took us an hour on a tour of dozens of thick electrical cables his troops had lain through the marshy battlefield, a spaghetti network that snaked in and out of the patchwork of lagoons. He showed us the mammoth electric generators that fed the exposed power lines from positions just behind the Iraqi front lines. And when the Iranian Revolutionary Guards made their regular evening advance, the officer and his men demonstrated the macabre genius of their invention. Iraqi gun batteries fired just enough artillery to force the Revolutionary Guards from their marsh boats, and when hundreds of them had been forced to continue their advance through the lagoons on foot, the men manning the Iraqi generators flipped a few switches and sent thousands of volts of electricity surging through the marshland. Within seconds, hundreds of Iranians were electrocuted. This occurred nightly. Story 5. Not so much the dirtiest trick as one of the most hard-nosed decisions. The first V-1 flying bombs, if you're under the age of 40, think first-generation cruise missiles, were being launched by Germany against London. And they were hitting. They were quote-unquote area weapons, as accuracy was pretty much a mile on any side of the aiming point, but they were coming down in central London. Germany had no agents in Britain, not one. They thought they did, but every agent they sent over was caught and then either turned or executed, and the other agents were all fictitious, imaginary ones dreamed up in a British campaign of disinformation that was and is breathtaking. The government decided that they simply didn't want to risk the buildings and architecture and heritage of the heart of London. Quite a lot had been bombed anyway. So the agents reported back to Berlin that the V-1s were overshooting their targets and coming down in North London. Fake stories planted in newspapers reinforced the deception. The Germans dutifully shortened the range, and the V-1s knocked the shit out of areas of South London. One reason why a lot of Croydon is 1960s concrete is because of the damage done by the V1s in 1944. In short, someone said, quote, "Our people are going to die and our buildings are going to be flattened whatever happens, so let it be here." Story 6. A lot of these will be depressing ones. As dirty or sneaky tricks go, Operation Mincemeat was crafty, or at least I'm looking for an excuse to post it. One April morning in 1943, a sardine fisherman spotted the corpse of a British soldier floating in the sea off the coast of Spain, setting in train a course of events that would change the course of World War II. Operation Mincemeat was the most successful wartime deception ever attempted, and certainly the strangest. It hoodwinked Nazi espionage chiefs, sent German troops racing in the wrong direction, and saved thousands of lives by deploying a secret agent who was different in one crucial respect from any spy before or since. He was dead. His mission was to convince the Germans that instead of attacking Sicily, the Allied armies would invade Greece. The brainchild of an eccentric Royal Air Force officer and a brilliant Jewish barrister, this great deception involved an extraordinary cast of characters, including Ian Fleming, who would go on to write the James Bond stories, a famous forensic pathologist, a beautiful Secret Service secretary, a submarine captain, pre-novelist, and an irascible admiral who loved fly fishing and a dead Welsh tramp. Using fraud, imagination, and seduction, Winston Churchill's team of spies spun a web of deceit so elaborate and so convincing that they began to believe it themselves. From a windowless basement beneath Whitehall, the hoax traveled from London to Scotland to Spain to Germany and ended up on Hitler's desk. Story 7. Operation Fortitude, D-Day. The Allies, for months and months, had been spreading disinformation and building up dummy armies and equipment from across from Pas de Calais. 6 fictional divisions were created, and with all kinds of radio traffic to match the activity of said divisions. Why was Pas de Calais important during World War II? Well, it was the closest land point to England. So many German generals, with the help of some Allied misdirection, strongly believed that when the Allies made the push into Fortress Europe, it would be at Pas de Calais, and based on the evidence, the attack would take place mid to late July. Hitler, who liked to micromanage, believed the attack was coming to Pas de Calais to a devastating degree. With heavy weather rolling in over the first few days of June, many on the German side had no idea that the attack was coming. Field Marshal Rommel, the man in charge of the defenses in France, based on intel, felt that there was no way the Allies would invade. So he took off back to Germany to surprise his wife for her birthday. The remaining German generals in the area had planned readiness exercises over June 5th and 6th to help prepare their troops for the upcoming invasion. When the Allies started their invasion by air the night before the sea landings, confusion on the German side was complete. The local resistance fighters were busy cutting phone lines and blowing up bridges. The paratroopers were hitting key locations, but at the same time, the Allies were also dropping dummies with firecrackers. So, some initial reports of Allied troops parachuting in were dismissed as nothing more than dummies with firecrackers. Some thought it was part of an exercise. I recall reading about one general who was sitting at his HQ listening to all the various reports, not quite sure what to make of everything, when all of a sudden an American paratrooper landed on the front lawn. Morning came around and the reports started coming in. Invasion is occurring in Normandy, and unfortunately for the Germans, those in charge back in Berlin didn't believe it. By 9:10 in the morning, the landings were under full swing. Berlin was fully aware of the situation. However, the generals who were in Berlin with Hitler decided not to wake Hitler, as the Allies weren't landing in Pas de Calais. As such, this was seen as a diversionary attack. Rommel finally made it back to France, assessed the situation, and requests that his panzer army be released so that he could drive the Allies back into the sea. It's important to note that many historians believe that had Rommel been allowed to move his tanks forward, it's very likely that they would have repelled the Allied invasion. But no, he was refused, and it wasn't until Hitler woke up around 2 or 3 in the afternoon on D-Day that he released the panzer armies to Rommel. At this point, though, it was much too late. Bridges were destroyed and Allies had control of the air about the area of operation. The Allies had cracked Fortress Europe, and it was the beginning but the end for the Germans. Story 8. The actor George Sanders found out that his friend David Niven was very chummy with Winston Churchill during the war. He asked Niv to give the Prime Minister a note detailing his idea for a new bomb that the RAF could drop on German cities. It would be exactly the same as all the old bombs, except it would have a wind-activated siren attached to it. So when the bombs dropped, the German civilian population hiding in shelters would hear the siren, think that the all clear was being sounded, and come out just as the bombs hit. Niven didn't say how Churchill took the idea. Story 9. Counterterrorism and anti-crime units have been seeding black market arms dealers with C4 explosive-laced ammo. Now when fired, the bullets tend to have a small explode effect on the weapons, rendering the weapon useless, and typically giving the user non-lethal but disfiguring hand and facial injuries. This bad ammo looks and feels like every other bullet that the dealer has sold, so the only solution is to stop using that arms dealer. Now you can't trust your existing arms dealer, and you have to find a new one that may or may not have tainted ammo, or even be a Fed. In essence, it shuts down an entire illegal arms industry at the cost of about 1 or 2 crates of C4 bullets mixed in with the others. Story 10. Genghis Khan, in a large-scale attack against a fortress at Volohai, after being unable to breach the walls, demanded 1,000 cats and 10,000 Chinese swallows in exchange for lifting the siege. When the defenders sent out the animals, Genghis took them and tied tufts of cotton to their tails and ignited them, at which point the animals rushed back to their homes within the city, igniting hundreds of small fires, while Genghis's army attacked again and took the fortress amidst the panic. Story 11. Not sure if it's been mentioned yet or not, but the Ghost Army was a pretty great trick. Maybe not dirty, but still really clever and underhanded. The 1,100-man unit was given a unique mission within the Allied army, to impersonate other Allied army units to deceive the enemy. From a few weeks after D-Day, when they landed in France, until the end of the war, they put on a quote-unquote traveling roadshow, utilizing inflatable tanks, sound trucks, fake radio transmissions, scripts, and pretense. They staged more than 20 battlefield deceptions, often operating very close to the front lines. Their story was kept secret for more than 40 years after the war, and elements of it remain classified. I think that's so fucking cool. You had entire airfields full of fake planes and shit, and Germany was running around going crazy over it, but it was all fake. So perfect. Plus, the insignia is really badass. Mr. Ghost just dropping some sick lightning bolts. Story 12. I read somewhere about a high-ranking officer in the Chinese military that was infamous among enemies and allies for his cleverness and ability to come up with unique war tactics. During some wars, the enemy army was marching towards some strategically valuable location. The general, knowing he could not let this army take the location, rode to a town that the army had to pass through to get there and sets up his plan. As the enemy army approaches the town, they see this general, all alone, sitting on an arch above the entrance, playing the flute. They turn right the fuck around and abandon the plan, fearing some brutal and elaborate ambush. The general was bluffing. He was the only person there. Story 13. I've got the winner, as written by the inimitable Gary Brecker. The British invaded Tibet in 1904, basically because they were bored. I'm serious. They owned everything on the planet worth having, so they were always having to invent new menaces to get funding for more invasions, grabbing the places they hadn't considered worth taking in their earlier waves of conquest. So in the late 1800s, they started talking up the Russian threat to swarm over the Himalayas and take away India. That was such utter crap that even the Brits talking up the threat must have had a laugh about it over their port back at the officers' club. Russia was weak. So weak that the Japanese crushed it on land and sea in 1905. The British knew Russia was in no position to threaten India. What they wanted was an easy conquest that would produce lots of medals, honors, and stuff to wear on their chests in the London social season so they could snag an heiress and never have to work again. So they invaded Tibet. The guy who ran that invasion, Francis Younghusband, was quite a piece of work himself. One of those India-born Brits who were generally fiercer and crazier even than the homegrown English. And he had that other feature that makes for a really ruthless conqueror. He was, as his biographies say, quote-unquote, deeply religious. If you hear that about a guy who's about to invade your country, go down to the basement, hoard lots of water and canned goods, and try to make yourself invisible for the next few years because it's not going to be pretty. Younghusband marched into Tibet in December 1903 with a force of Sikhs and Gurkhas, a pretty scary mix, like Rottweiler plus Pitbull. And the Gurkhas were definitely the pitbulls in that pair. Sikhs are very tough but not blood crazy. The Gurkhas were not only devoted lovers of knife work, especially on prisoners of wars, but ancient enemies of the Tibetans. It didn't take much to push them to a massacre. The Tibetans knew the British were dangerous and tried not to resist at all, but as the British force pushed farther and farther into Tibet, the local commanders decided to resist. That was a mistake. This wasn't Tony Blair's cool Britannia they were dealing with. On March 31, 1904, Young Husband encountered a Tibetan militia force of about 2,000 guarding a pass near Gyantse. He must have had a hard time keeping a straight face or wiping the drool from his lips, thinking about the medals he'd get for this one, because the Tibetans were armed either with spears and swords, or at best with matchlock muskets. That's right, the kind of 17th century firearm that won't fire unless you apply the smoldering wick to the firing pan. Young Husband decided to play with the poor f***ers he was facing. He said, my friends, what's all this hostility? What's this paranoia? Here, I'll tell my soldiers to take the bullets out of their rifles, and you tell your soldiers to put out the flame of their matchlocks." The Tibetans, who had no idea that Young Husband's troops had modern repeating rifles, put out their matchlocks. Young Husband then ordered his troops to open fire. 1,300 Tibetans were killed with almost no British casualties. Young Husband thought it was a great triumph, but this was already late in the imperial era, and the people back home had had enough of this kind of triumph. In fact, it sort of made them sick. The whole thing was hushed up and remains hushed up to this day. Ask any Brit you know if they ever heard of their invasion of Tibet, and I guarantee they'll plead ignorance. It's probably better that way too. Makes it easy to put one of those Free Tibet Rising Sun stickers on your Land Rover without feeling like a hypocrite. Story 14. Madeleine de Verchères was a 14-year-old girl in New France, now Quebec, in 1692, was left in charge of Fort Verchères with one old man and a handful of soldiers to guard her and the settlers, while her parents, her father was a seigneur of the fort, went to gather winter supplies. They were out tending the gardens when the Iroquois attacked and made off with most of the soldiers. She was grabbed but untied some clothing and escaped. She made it to the fort, closed the gates, and fired off some muskets to make the Iroquois think that there were more than just her, the old man, and 2 soldiers left in the fort. Over the next few days, she led other families into the fort in the guise of bringing in reinforcements, and moved around the fort firing guns and marching on the bastions to make it appear as if there was a substantial garrison. The Iroquois held off their attack. Reinforcements from Montreal finally arrived, and she handed command to them just after the Iroquois left for an easier target. This is like Home Alone, Medieval Edition. Story 15. Operation Grief by the Germans in World War II. The idea was that German soldiers would infiltrate the Americans by wearing American uniforms, traveling in American vehicles, and speaking American English, in such a way that they would be able to relay false orders and gather American intel. Quite an interesting and deceptive idea, but it didn't really go as planned. They weren't able to muster that many German troops who could speak American English and know about American culture and idioms. Additionally, they didn't have that many American vehicles, so they would either use captured Sherman tanks that had already been shot to shit, or their own tanks disguised in such a way that at first they'd look like they were Shermans, but upon closer inspection, could be seen to be German tanks. Furthermore, it became difficult for the actual German soldiers to tell the difference between the American soldiers and their fellow German soldiers in disguise. However, it did succeed in creating some suspicions among the Americans. For example, soldiers would start asking each other questions that they felt only genuine Americans would know the real answer to. Another example is when General Omar Bradley was held by American soldiers for several hours because they suspected him of being a German in disguise. It wasn't only until another general arrived and was able to identify General Bradley that he was finally released. Basically a good plan in theory, but didn't fully work in practice. Story 16. I don't know that it was the dirtiest trick, but Project Eldest Son certainly deserves note. The project focused on the placement of exploding cartridges into supplies used by the communist combat forces in Southeast Asia. Basically, special forces would find ammo caches in the jungle while out on recon, but instead of destroying it, they would replace one in every few dozen or so rounds with specially crafted rounds packed with high explosive instead of smokeless powder. An AK-47 chamber is rated for about 50,000 psi. The HE they used produced around 250,000 psi. The resulting random explosions maimed users, sowing distrust and paranoia toward their weapons among the rest of the forces, heavily demoralizing them. Story 17. During the War of 1812, North American edition, British and First Nation forces countered a series of American raids by besieging Detroit. British Major General Isaac Brock and Shawnee leader Tecumseh had a smaller force than American Brigadier General William Hull, and of course didn't have the advantage of a fort, so they decided to play a ruse. A false letter was allowed to be captured by the Americans stating that over 5,000 First Nation fighters, double the size of Hull's forces, had arrived across the river at Amherstburg and that they should stop coming as it was straining supply lines. Brock sent a letter to Hull advising surrender and claiming to have little control over Tecumseh's warriors. The force at my disposal authorizes me to require of you the immediate surrender of Fort Detroit. It is far from my intention to join in a war of extermination, but you must be aware that the numerous body of Indians who have attached themselves to my troops will be beyond control the moment the contest commences. Brock then dressed up his militia in the excess uniforms of regulars, implying a more seasoned force. He had his soldiers light individual campfires at night instead of a single fire per unit. And then the piece de resistance. They marched their soldiers in a big circle partly inside of the American position, making it look like their ranks were endless. Brock and Tecumseh took Detroit and captured 2,500 soldiers, a larger force than their own, suffered only 2 wounded. Story 18. During medieval times in northern Italy in the region of Piedmont, a city was being besieged. This big city was protected by walls, so the best way to win for the invading army was to wait until the city ran out of food. After a few months, people were starving and the only thing left were a few bags of rice and a couple of cows. People gathered in a town hall to evaluate the possibility of surrender. They determined that the city had food to last a few more weeks, and during the meeting, a young boy had an idea. A few days later, that boy came out of the city walls with one of the last few cows left inside the town. He approached the besieging army commander and asked if he could throw the cow out of the city because there was a lack of space due to the enormous amount of food they still had. The army commander looked at the cow and saw it was fat, and the boy replied, "We also had to feed the cow rice because of the lack of space in the food storage. Everything is full." The army commander killed the cow and cut it open and saw that there was rice inside its stomach. Thinking that the city could last for years until it surrendered, the army commander stopped the siege and went away. Story 19. This one's a bit more cheeky than dirty, but the fact that the Germans, when manufacturing the new version of the Carbiner and named it the Carbiner 98 Kurz. This obviously was because they weren't allowed to make bolt-action rifles, but only allowed to make carbines. And Kurz, of course, means short, so basically it was a carbine version of the regular Carbiner. Except that it wasn't a carbine at all and was only named that to fool the others. Again, not that dirty, but cheeky.